Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on our first podcast. We had just completed our first In the Lab with Origin and Cause webinar about destructive testing, and there was a lot of great questions that were submitted to us. So I have Mazen Habash here with me, as well as Art Beleda. We are in our Ancaster office laboratory, and we just wanted to go through some of the questions that were submitted, some that we did go through, and some that we weren't able to get by the end of the webinar because there's so many great questions. We wanted to kind of go through it all with you guys. So I'd like to introduce Mazen and Art first. So Mazen is the president of Origin and Cause. He has 30 years of industry experience and has completed over 3,000 forensic investigations. He's an electrical and computer engineer. His specialties are fires and explosions, electrical failures and malfunctions, product liability incidents, alarm system investigations, and security camera video extraction. So thanks for joining us, Mazen.
Thank you very much, and greetings from beautiful Lancaster, Ontario.
And we also have Art Beleda here. He is a fire investigator and senior engineering technologist at Origin and Cause. He has over 10 years of experience in the industry. He also focuses on commercial and residential fire investigations. He is part of our forensic visual services unit and specializes in radiology, which is x-ray examinations. Thanks for joining us, Art.
Thank you, George.
So I'm just going to go through these questions. It's just like a very casual discussion, and any of you guys can just jump in. First question I have here is, why do you call your testing destructive?
The nature of the work that we do oftentimes involves us taking apart equipment to get to the root cause of the suspected cause of the fire in the piece of equipment. So this is why it's called destructive, because once we've conducted the investigation and we've conducted the lab examination, oftentimes the exhibit itself cannot be put back together. It's of a destructive form, as opposed to a non-destructive examination where we take x-rays.
Yeah, so it's a technical term, an industry term, right? So there's non-destructive examinations, and then there's destructive, where you actually take apart the subject of your investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, I'll jump to the next question. During visual examinations, you may remove certain parts or elements of the subject of your destructive or non-destructive exam. So have you ever had an issue with spoliation or allegations of spoliation of evidence due to these small removals? Like, say for example, it was a stove. So like in the webinar, we actually had a stove, and in the non-destructive portion of the examination, you took off certain panels to take photos, and it's part of your documentation process. Have you ever encountered a spoliation of evidence sort of allegation due to that?
Well, you know what? That's a good question, George. And it's always something that a forensic engineer, a forensic investigator needs to be cognizant of. The fact that as you start to systematically examine a piece of equipment for potentially determining the cause of a fire, one needs to be sure that the documentation in that systematic way is done properly. In other words, make sure that you document the systematic dismantling of a piece of equipment, but to also make sure that you understand that once you get to a certain stage where dismantling it any further will alter the evidence, preventing someone else from looking at that evidence in the same fashion that you did, is basically terminated. In other words, make sure that if you go any further, you've invited all interested parties so that they can look at the evidence in that same way.
Great, thank you. Next question. From your experience, do you notice more fires occurring with older stoves, or are new stoves just as likely to start a fire?
From my personal experience, I don't think it matters regardless of how aged the stove itself is, whether it's a newer stove or an older stove, because a lot of times it's the circumstances surrounding the fire that's why the fire had occurred. A lot of these fires involving stoves are of human nature or human cause, where a stove control, for example, could have inadvertently been turned on while somebody's moving some items into their apartment or their house. Or let's say they have a younger child and they have a configuration of a stove where the controls are actually situated at the front. In the past, they've inadvertently been turned on by children or just by accidentally leaning over it. Also, of course, the main root cause of human error when it comes to stove fires is unintended cooking activities. So let's say you're preparing a meal on one of the stovetop elements, and you walk out of the room and you forget about it, and you conduct, you do other errands around the house, and then all of a sudden you have a kitchen fire. So the vintage of the stove in that situation does not play into any, factor in determining.
Well, my understanding is appliances are becoming more and more complicated. There's more like complications in computers and so on that are getting introduced to these appliances. Have you guys seen any trends where there's losses relating to those types of malfunctions? Because that obviously wouldn't be relevant to an older appliance, right? So
Yeah, George, it's a good point. The other thing is the newer appliances have more safety features built into them.
oh, okay.
So in the example of an electric range, for example, some of the newer appliances now have these temperature or heating elements. So they don't get as hot, or at least there's controls on how hot they get. So that kind of curtails the possibility of, let's say, a pot full of grease being heated enough so that it will actually create the ignition of these vapors. So yes, the appliances are getting more complicated, they're getting more sophisticated, but fortunately, there are safety features that are built in that the older appliances just did not have.
Interesting. All right, let's jump to another question. Is there an established protocol for the steps you're taking during a destructive test? In other words, can another engineer object to taking certain things apart?
There is an established protocol that we tend to send out to our clients and tend to send out to other experts that might be attending the examination itself. This protocol, if there's any alterations to the protocol that the other person might object to, it's always advisable that they object to this prior to the actual examination being conducted, and it is then decided upon the rest of the party members or the interested party members whether or not this deviation from the set out protocol, the initial protocol, is acceptable, and the parties can at that point possibly agree to any alterations before the actual examination.
So there is a communication pushed out with kind of, hey, this is what we think is a reasonable protocol or a way of doing this, and then people have the opportunity to push back and suggest otherwise or agree. Is that
Yeah,
how
absolutely.
usually
And you
works?
know what? It's encouraged because ultimately, the bottom line is we want to get to the bottom of how an incident occurred. So once a protocol is reviewed, if there's any objections, then an objection is made. It is reviewed by all the experts, and an agreement is reached on whether to modify it or stick to the original protocol. The other thing is, protocols are great, but they're not cast in stone. In other words, at the examination, sometimes you get to a point where you've dismantled something, and visually the experts decide that based on what they see, there needs to be additional things done during the examination. So the protocol should be followed, but it can be altered while the examination is being carried out. Again, the important thing is to get the agreement of all interested parties and all the available experts at that time.
Great. Okay, thank you. Next question. If the cause of the loss was determined to be a failed mechanism in a particular component or appliance, would you be able to identify the manufacturer of that particular mechanism for a client so that they could put whoever the manufacturer is on notice? And how can you tell them who makes what?
There are often ways to be able to identify the individual components within a failed appliance or another item, electrical item, for example. Oftentimes in appliances, let's take a stove, for example. They'll have an identifying manufacturer's plate that is situated somewhere on top, somewhere in the stove itself. Oftentimes you find it on the lower compartment when you open it up, the storage compartment on the side of the frame, or the actual oven compartment itself. If you can identify that information, then you can identify the manufacturer, the model number, and the serial numbers, and the individual parts themselves. If you suspect that there is a failure to one of the parts, sometimes they're actually stamped as well. So you can conduct a search and do some research there to determine the individual manufacturers of the components within a larger appliance itself.
So you're saying, like, say for example in a stove, or let's say a dryer. So you're saying that there's manufacturers of various parts of that one dryer, right?
That's correct.
And they have stamps, their own individual stamps on each of the components that they manufactured. Is that right?
Yes, George, that's correct. I mean, every component is manufactured typically by one or more different manufacturers. They will either have a label on it, or if it's metal, it's usually stamped. Typically, that is how we identify individual subcomponents on a larger appliance. Sometimes, if we cannot identify the manufacturer of a larger appliance by looking at individual components, we can narrow down the date of the manufacturer and possibly, based on those components, who manufactured the overall appliance.
And also, just to chime in there as well, sometimes what you could actually recognize is also the certain shape of a certain component. If we've identified certain failures in products in the past of the same manufacturer, sometimes you don't even have to have the actual manufacturer's label itself or serial number, and just the shape of itself. For example, you can identify certain features are common to certain manufacturers of certain products.
Interesting. So it's through your exposure of these things time and time again, you're able to notice these patterns of, oh yeah, that looks like a whatever product, right?
That's correct.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Next question. So sometimes there are third parties that get on scene prior to engineers being there and actually completing their investigation. Now, these third parties, in some instances, have full control of the scene, so therefore you don't necessarily know if anything has been changed in the scene. So is there any issues with spoliation or allegations of spoliation based on that, knowing that there were so many parties prior to your completion of your investigation? Because you're basing your investigation off of what you saw at the time, right? But knowing that there were other people on scene prior to that, have you guys encountered that that defense, for example?
It's something that can happen very frequently, and it does happen very frequently with third parties getting involved. For example, for fire departments, if they're a fire prevention officer attends the fire scene and conducts his own investigation, sometimes the scene isn't preserved to the condition that we would like to see it in viewing it for ourselves on behalf of our clients. Same with other parties, fire marshal's office. And what we do in these types of situations, we actually contact the third parties to have a discussion with these people to see what has been done to the scene, what has been moved, what's the scope of the work that has been conducted, so that we have an idea of what we're looking at when we actually walk into the fire scene, so we can best reconstruct it as we can possibly do the best job that we can possibly do.
Yeah. And those discussions, like I guess because you guys are engaged with each other so frequently in these types of incidents, I guess they're very compliant, or how do those conversations go?
Well, of course, it depends on your past experience with these individuals. It depends on to what extent they altered the scene evidence or the physical damage that's there. Sometimes they are kind enough to show us photographs that they took when they're systematically doing their investigations. But one thing I want to point out, it's not just third parties that can alter the evidence before we get there. There are times when, unfortunately, the weather elements alters evidence for us. There are times when there is structural collapse that happens following the fire that alters the evidence for us. And it's every fire investigator, every forensic engineer has to deal with these conditions. They have to know what was altered and how it impacts their opinion. And I think the most important thing is to really understand what the implications are of this altered evidence and make sure that you take into account the altered evidence when coming to a conclusion on the cause of any incident.
Great, thank you. Another question here: when does origin and cause expert, or when do origin and cause experts actually come into play? Are they called only when it's a large loss?
Interesting, George. It is typical that we get called in on all kinds of losses. So, as an example, I know Art tomorrow is going to go and look at a fire scene where the claim is rather small. On the other hand, one of our investigators is doing a fire investigation on a barn fire in southwestern Ontario. That's almost $700,000 in damages. So it depends. I mean, we do small claims, investigations relating to small fires, small incidents, but also the very large ones as well.
Great. Another question. Oftentimes, not all potentially responsible parties can be put on notice prior to destructive testing or investigation. What steps do you take to avoid allegations of spoliation when dealing with evidence that you inspect in a destructive fashion?
George, that's another great question that you've asked. And I'll give you an example of how that comes to be. If we go to a fire scene and let's say we identify that the fire started on a kitchen counter, and there are 2 or 3 kitchen appliances that were on that counter, all heavily damaged. One of the things that we would like to do, of course, is identify who manufactured these appliances so that we can notify them so that a destructive examination can be carried out. What if the owner of the home or the tenant cannot identify for us the brand of the appliance? And what if the damage is quite severe, not allowing us to confirm the manufacturer prior to a destructive examination? One of the things that we do is we conduct an examination. We either do x-rays, and then sometimes it has to be that some of the appliance needs to be taken apart so that we can hopefully identify who manufactured it. The point is, you need to do what you need to do to get to the point where you can identify who the interested parties are. At that point, once you've identified them, then it is your responsibility to stop any further destructive examination until they can be notified and then reconvene and complete your examination.
Great, thank you, Mazen. Next question. When you're in the lab, what else do you use your X-ray equipment for?
Very frequently, we use it for all different types of items. Often the case is, what happens often with myself is the investigator will come in from a fire scene and, for example, he'll have like a melted mass of plastic and he'll say, there's some electrical devices within this melted piece of plastic, but I'm not quite able to distinguish what it is because of the nature of the fire and how much damage is caused. And also sometimes the insured doesn't recall what could have been in there.
So it's just like a big blob of plastic with wires sticking out of it. You have no idea what's in it.
Exactly. A lot of the times that's what it is. And the investigator asks me, can you identify what's in here? And possibly if you've identified what's in there, are there any electrical failures that you can visually see, on a preliminary basis, that you could say, okay, well, this is an item of interest now. Maybe we should dig a little bit deeper into this. Also with the X-ray technology, a lot of the times we'll be able to seize an exemplar, from the fire scene itself. For example,
what's an exemplar?
An exemplar is a comparative product. Let's say you have a bathroom fan that's suspected causes the cause of a fire. If you have 2 bathrooms, let's say in a townhouse on different levels, oftentimes you can be able to extract the exemplar fan, which is an undamaged fan of the exact type of fan that sustained the cause. And you can do comparative analysis. You can take x-rays of both devices. That's going to be able to assist you with your investigation as to what components you're looking at. What happens in the whole process of a fire is things distort, things melt, they get displaced. And if you have exemplar units, then that's a good comparative analysis. Also, what types of items I typically examine, a lot of common items are duplex receptacles or wall outlets, for example, printed circuit boards, safety devices like high limit switches. It varies. There's a wide range of products. Some products X-ray well, and some others don't. For example, some materials such as cast iron, things of more dense nature, it's really difficult to determine any type of cause from, but electrical items tend to typically X-ray very well.
So you're saying cast iron is more of a dense material, therefore it's harder to get to X-ray those.
That's right.
Interesting. But like the typical product that's out there, you know what I mean, on the shelves, it's something that I've seen actually in the lab one time, you were X-raying a lawnmower.
That's right. Items such as that, lower density items where there's some electrical components within it, items that X-ray really well are, for example, coffee makers, toasters, again, outlets.
Yeah.
Let's say scented night lights that you plug into walls. Smaller type of devices X-ray really well, and wiring, for example. A lot of times we'll be able to X-ray some wiring and determine if it's sustained an arcing failure.
Great, thanks. Next question. What is the average time a destructive exam takes?
Well, you know what? I'm asked that question quite often. How long is this going to take? And the answer that I would give is it depends on the items that we are going to actually be looking at in the lab. It depends how many items they are, what their complications are in terms of how long it might take to actually take them apart. Another big factor in how long it takes is how many experts are involved. If you can imagine, if there is 2 experts that are looking at an item, both experts would need to take their own photographs, take their own notes as the item is being systematically dismantled. Now add 2 more experts, well, that typically doubles the time it takes to look at the equipment. So again, it depends on the nature of the item itself, but it also depends on the complications of having multiple experts looking at the item at the same time.
So on average, this is just out of curiosity for me, like how many experts on average usually attend these examinations?
Well, it seems more and more that you have at least 3 or 4 experts on an examination at any one time. In the past, it may have been one other person, but now as there are more subcomponents to different items that we look at, these need to be represented by experts. So I would say that on average, it's 3 to 4 minimum.
Very interesting. And so inherently, the time has increased.
Yes, inherently the time that it takes to look at a specific item has gone up because of the involvement of more experts.
Great, thanks, Mazen. Next question is, you talked quite a bit about putting interested parties on notice in the webinar. Can you provide some insight on ways that interested parties can be identified? So usually you guys have completed your report at this point. You've identified who may be the manufacturer or whatever, any interested parties that is probably should be involved in the process, in the investigative process. So what does it mean by getting people, having interested people identified or interested parties identified?
What it means is that point, once you've identified, for example, an item that's as the suspected cause of the fire, there's going to be people that also possibly installed this item at some point, people that also serviced this item at some point. That's very important as well. It's not just the manufacturer of the item itself, it's also any people that had any recent dealings with this item. In that situation, if you can identify these parties, what you'd actually have your adjuster do is to say, what, we've completed our scene examination, we've identified this as a potential cause of this fire. These are the parties that should be contacted in order for us to conduct further destructive examination testing on this item.
You had mentioned that usually you would have the adjuster put people on notice.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like you've made that clear that adjusters put people on notice, not you. Why is that?
We don't want to introduce bias in our investigation. That way we're at arm's length of the investigation. We have identified the players, and by them putting these people on notice, we don't introduce bias on our own side of the investigation.
So you actually can't. You're not allowed to put anyone on notice because that's not.
Well, I think, George, allowed to or not, I think we follow certain protocols. We follow certain standards. There are ASTM standards that dictate or at least suggest the protocols that we need to follow in conducting several things, such as an investigation. How do we put people on notice? And one of the ASTM standards specifically says that an investigating engineer or a forensic engineer or a fire investigator is not the party that puts people on notice. That should be the client, which in our case, it's typically the insurance company or an independent adjuster or an examiner or a subrogation specialist.
Okay, and then so they put that person on notice. You identify who would be involved or who should be the interested parties, it is on it's on them to actually put these people on notice. They contact you guys, I guess.
Yeah, typically once the parties have been put on notice, either we're contacted directly by the parties or their experts that they've retained, and it is at that point then, of course, this is something of a bit of a chore because trying to schedule an examination date with 3, 4, 5 different experts, some possibly coming in from the Far East, some coming from the US, some coming from different parts of Canada, is quite an arduous task. It may take a month or two for us to find a proper or a date that everyone's available, and at that point, we schedule the date and we go ahead with the examination.
I've actually heard of a joint examination with 19 different experts. So I can't even imagine how difficult it was to actually schedule that. You have 19 different people coming from all over the world with all of their own schedules and
it is. It's very difficult, and sometimes that is the reason why it takes so long to go through the process of coming to a final conclusion into the area of origin and the cause of the fire. It's a process that you need to follow. The process has to be followed correctly, just so that there is no criticism of spoliation of evidence or criticism of not giving the opportunity for the proper expert to be identified by all the various interested parties to be present during that examination.
But it is worth going through that process because that's what equips you with the necessary tools to effectively subrogate. So that's the trick here. It's like you can't necessarily skip a bunch of steps and hope for the best when you're actually submitting documentation to the third party. You need to make sure that you're following the right steps so that it's a really airtight documentation or proposal that you're presenting to that third party. So they see that there's no holes to be poked here. You've proceeded in the correct way. You have the documentation in place, and therefore that would probably enable subrogation significantly.
Absolutely.
All right, next question. In your experience, how often is a cooking fire as a result of a malfunction of the stove?
Good question, George. Oftentimes, throughout our investigations of stove fires, we find that it's human error related to unattended cooking activities or the stove being accidentally turned on. But of course, this is why we conduct our investigation of the actual stove itself, because in some cases we do find internal electrical failures of the stove, although this is not very often the case.
Great, thanks, Art. Next question. I think this is actually the last question. Interesting that you examined a stove in the webinar. Have you had instances when a stove element is turned on accidentally, which I think, Art, you just mentioned? I'm dealing with a kitchen fire with the stove not used for several months. However, the stovetop being used for storage of contents.
Yeah, George, it's interesting because we often come across people who, for whatever reason, decide to use their service top for an electric range or a gas stove for storage purposes. Very unfortunate because it is not very difficult to accidentally turn on a control for one of the heating elements for an electric range or the gas burners. And if there are combustible materials on that surface top, well, you've got a fire. There are many ways in which these stove controls can be turned on accidentally. Again, I think Art mentioned earlier, if these are front-mounted, someone brushing up against the stove can turn one of these elements on. Kids can turn them on. At the rear, if they are electrical controls at the rear and people are placing items for storage, if they push these items up against the back of the stove control, on occasion, those controls can be turned on accidentally. So again, the best way to prevent this is by not having items stored on your stove top or your electric range service top, and certainly not combustible items.
Great, thank you, Mazen. I actually had one more question submitted via email right now, and that will conclude the podcast. The last question is, would age of an appliance play a factor in whether to do a destructive test or not? just inquiring about subrogation. Appliances aren't meant to last forever. So, say for example, we're talking about a appliance that's 25 years old. I guess what's being asked here is that a reasonable, has it hit its life cycle or lifespan? Sorry.
It's interesting because there's many instances where we are asked to investigate an appliance causing an incident, whether it's a fire or some other kind of incident. The age of the appliance is very important, but as forensic engineers, our job is to try and identify if a failure has occurred or not. I think the question that's being asked is more appropriate to ask to get a legal opinion on that. The age of the equipment, and whether or not it's too old in terms of being an item that can be thought of in terms of subrogation. I've had instances where appliances have been 20 years old and they have failed, they have caused a fire. The insurance company has actually gone after the manufacturer and been successful at it. So it depends. I mean, if there's been a recall notice, for example, on an appliance, even if it's 20, 25 years old, as long as you can confirm that the failure of that appliance is basically the subject of the recall hazard, then I think it's something that can be successfully subrogated. Again, though, I suspect that this is something that a lawyer can answer best.
Great. Thank you very much, Mazen. And thank you, Art, as well, for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for submitting your questions. It was a very successful webinar, and I hope you enjoyed this podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.